All right. Thank you for joining us today. I'm DW Hits with Fedawar Press. Today I'm joined with Ian Martinez Cassmeyer. I'm sorry, Cassmeyer. And we are here to talk today about his writing and his work. And Ian, tell us a little bit about you as an author.
Well, I specialize in particular in science fiction and fantasy. Those are the two genres that I mainly work in. And those are the two genres that I find myself drawn to write in. Why exactly, I'm not entirely sure. It's just that that's what I grew up enjoying when I was a little kid, when I was reading. Not only when I was reading, but also in all the other kind of popular entertainment that I enjoyed in my childhood. But also, just the freedom that both those genres afford the author in terms of the things you can explore, in terms of the world you can create. Just you can always there's just so much scope
Mhm.
within science fiction and fantasy that I honestly don't understand why more people don't either read it or write in it. But that's just me.
No, I completely understand where you're coming from. The science fiction and fantasy, they give you the ability to create any kind of world, to have any kind of thing happen, and it's such a freedom when you're coming from a storytelling standpoint. Um, I don't know. I do think there are certain people who maybe they don't like it because they like concrete things. They like things to exist as they do in the real world.
I suppose so.
But then again, when we're talking about fiction, aren't we?
We are, and science fiction and fantasy takes full advantage of the fact that you're writing fiction. It kind of reminds me of something that noted science fiction and fantasy author Brandon Sanderson once said about these genres, which is the fact that in science fiction and fantasy, you can write a story that is that features the greatest, most well plotted murder mystery or the most steamy or beautiful romance story or the greatest piece of high adventure. You can do all that, plus you can have dragons or aliens if it's science fiction, and
Hmm.
it just affords you to be able to do anything. It's such a wide canvas that it makes me it just makes me wonder why more people don't enjoy it. But thankfully, in popular culture these days, I mean, it's not so uncommon to find science fiction fantasy fans because we've kind of taken over everything.
Yeah, definitely.
I
Yeah,
mean,
I mean,
occasionally you do get a historical fiction or a period piece here or there, or something like Bridgerton, which is, just straight romance that's sort of mired in period history, but it's everywhere, and everybody seems to find something within it that they can enjoy, whether it's the darker stuff of Joe Abercrombie or Game of Thrones or The Witcher, or it's the slightly more lighter stuff, which is what I find myself tending to write anyway. But
mhm. No, I definitely agree with that. I mean, even if you look at something like Star Wars, like people like to simplify into, space wizards having to battle over this or that. At the heart of the story, at least the original story, it was an opera, or it was a soap opera.
mhm,
The story of a single family and what happened to them and all the craziness that happened to them. But it's in a science fiction setting,
exactly.
and so much of fantasy and science fiction and so much of many of the genres a lot of times I feel is kind of, while they each have their own specific tropes that sometimes have to be used, a lot of times it's kind of window dressing.
Yeah.
um, that this, you can tell the same story whether it's in space or in front of a dragon or whatnot, as long as you please those readers with what they're looking for.
And on the one hand, I do think that sometimes the best SFF, science fiction and fantasy, does feature those tropes just as window dressing. At the same time, that's also sometimes a critique that gets volleyed at these genres, which is the fact that if you have this interesting story or you've got this well-written tale that has prose that rivals that of Ursula K. Le Guin, then why would you want to put it into a science fiction or fantasy context? The solution, of course, is to make that setting or to make that world that you're putting the story into vital, which is
Mhm.
another thing that's wonderful about these genres, is the fact that you do get to invent those worlds. And so making sure that, yes, on the one hand, the story that you're telling is a human story, making that interesting, making sure that the world it's set in important to the story is also, I think, crucial. So that way, it's
Mhm.
not purely window dressing. But you are right. The window
Mhm.
dressing thing is sometimes the case, especially in a lot of more recent fantasy and science fiction, at least from what I've seen.
No, and I definitely agree. You want um, your setting, where the story is taking part to be as much of a character of the story as everything else that's happening. So,
Absolutely.
so tell me, you have your story with Fedor Press inside Starcrossed,
Ooh, look at
um,
that gorgeous book right there.
which we have the link for this is down in the description down below. Um, is Slow Recovery. Now,
Yes.
tell us what gave you the inspiration to write this story, and can you tell us a little bit about what the story is about?
Well, the original inspiration to Slow Recovery was actually it predated the guidelines that I believe it was you and Renee kind of gave us. By Renee, I mean Renee Gendron, who I believe contributed a story to this book as well as
Mhm,
acted as an editor of sorts to it,
mhm.
to everything, or at least kind of shepherded it through the publishing process. It started really with that opening paragraph, and I hope you'll forgive me if I read that to the audience
Oh,
real
go
quick.
ahead.
I've got it down here on my phone. Um, when Juan awoke, he couldn't recall how he'd ended up in the starship medical bay. His vision was a bit unfocused and his head throbbed. A concussion, most likely, so he didn't sit up. Another dull sting also emanated from his right arm. Slowly, he lifted it over his head, and his heartbeat broke into a sprint. A bandage encased his whole arm below the elbow, everything but his missing forefinger and thumb. What in the galaxy had happened to him? And that was where it really started. I had kind of that image of this man waking up in a Starship medical bay with a missing forefinger and thumb, and he couldn't figure out how he'd ended up there. He didn't remember how he'd been injured. And so the mystery of what happened to him was really what drove the story. And it just so happened that uh, the tale that I was telling could fit pretty well into the parameters that you and Renee gave us for each of
Mhm,
the stories that were going to be featured in this book.
mhm.
So
And can
yeah,
you
it
tell us
really just started with the character and the situation.
okay, can you tell us a little bit more about the where the plot goes, or
Yes,
without giving away too much?
yeah. The story takes place on a spaceship, as that one little detail about the Starship Medical Bay features. It takes place on a spaceship called the ESS Livingstone, that's heading towards this outpost of, I guess you could call it a human empire, but I don't think I ever call it that in the story. Um, and as they're heading towards this space station, what Juan, my main character, is trying to do is piece together roughly the last 14 hours of memory that he's lost. He kind of calculates it in his head. He realizes that he's lost about that much memory. He realizes he has a case of sort of short-term pocket amnesia. I name exactly what it's called in the story. I'm just I don't happen to be on that page right now, otherwise I'd say that. And as they're making their way towards this outpost, he's just slowly trying to piece together what happened, how he ended up in the medical bay, how he ended up with this concussion, how he ended up missing his forefinger and thumb, and eventually he figures out what happens.
It is a lot of fun. I really enjoy this story.
I had a I actually got a very good compliment about this story, if I can toot my own horn really quick.
Please do.
A friend of mine bought the book, I think an ebook, the ebook edition, because I think that was the only one that was available at the time for him. But he got to my story and he read it, and then he was going along with the mystery because there's several of the scenes are basically just flashbacks. You know, they move the story forward, then this sort of sensory image jars something loose in Juan's mind, and suddenly he remembers this whole scene that I just have the reader relive with him. Uh, and then he arrived at that last flashback that comes pretty close to the end of the story, and I think his exact expression was, "The back of my head blew off." I took that as a compliment, but
Yeah, that's quite a compliment.
when you can delay the great reveal of a story, especially one that's got kind of a mystery element embedded in it, it's to that point, and it still shocks people. It's wonderful.
Well, that sounds fantastic. And I encourage all of our viewers to go out there and check it out.
Absolutely, and my story is not the only one that's wonderful in this collection. I mean, all the other 7 stories that are featured here are just excellent, and you know, let's just say Starcross would make a good addition to anybody's personal library.
And I'll second that. So tell us, what are you working on right now?
At the moment, I've got a couple of irons in the fire. In the near future, there will be an anthology that's going to come out, another charity anthology that a couple of cohorts of mine decided that we were going to put together. I think you might recall that when we were doing Beneath the Twin Suns before we got to the Star-Crossed anthology, there was a group of us who kind of decided that we were going to do a zombie anthology out of that cluster. You might recall that. Well, we ended up doing that. It came out last January, so it's been out over a year now. It's called The New Normal, and so that same cohort is doing another one of shapeshifter stories.
Ah,
We unfortunately don't have a title for the book just yet. Otherwise, I'd give you that. Um, but we are putting that together. Hopefully, it'll be out sometime this upcoming summer. And I have a short story featuring in that. It's called Ashling. So look forward to that in the near future. I also have a novel that I'm working on at the moment. I'm slowly making my way through the first major pass of revisions on it. That's called A Sword Named Sylph, and it's set in the same world that Ashling is set in, so it's kind of part of this whole secondary world that I'm slowly building one story at a time. And finally, another anthology that I'm a part of is one that's being run by a young woman by the name of Bree Gary, who you might be familiar with from Twitter. She's brought together about 50 writers, and what we've done is we've created a special world that's just generally called the city, but it's a city full of monsters. And the anthology itself is going to be an urban fantasy anthology with 50 different stories, each one featuring a story about a particular monster. And I've got a
hmm.
story in there that'll be out. I'm not entirely sure how Bree's going to manage this one, but she's a wonder worker in many ways, and she's an excellent editor. So look forward to that as well.
Wow, very cool. That sounds like a big book too. 50 stories.
It is. That's what I'm saying is like I'm not entirely sure how she's going to manage it because she wants everybody to be a part of the anthology, who's going to be part of the anthology, to be paid as well. So I think
Hmm.
maybe we might end up kickstarting it or something.
Hmm.
Or we might end up having to do it in like 2 volumes. So 25 stories in one book and 25 stories in another book. But it's all part of this shared world that we've spent the last 4 or 5 months world building over on World Anvil. So
Hmm.
everybody can actually go because the anthology has its own Twitter account, by the way. It's called the Monthology, the
Okay.
Monster Anthology. So they can go check that out there. And there's a link to everything that we've compiled, the history of the world. I think the monster profiles that are all featured there are slowly going up one at a time. And Bree is just, I mean, she's a creative tour de force in her own right. So hopefully that'll be out sometime in the near future as well.
Fantastic. And I'll mention to our readers, remember that all of Ian's information is in the description down below, including, I believe, his website and his Twitter. So make sure you follow that for more information on these future projects. Um, So tell me, Ian, what exciting things do you see in your future?
Well, the novel, first of all, which I hope to have be the beginning point of a series.
Hmm.
Um, we'll see whether or not that happens because, of course, the thing about series is that the first book usually has to be pretty successful in order for a series to be uh, in the future. But I've got at least like 15 books kind of semi planned out for
Mm.
this series, for this sequence of books. So fingers crossed that it goes well. So that's the first thing. And actually, in the more near future, if anybody cares to check it out, I have a story coming out that will be going live this Friday from a new magazine called Wingraph, and that story is called "The God's Apology," and it'll be going live on their website this week. So look forward to that.
Hmm.
Yeah,
All
I
right.
literally, when you sent the email to send the link to get me to this stream. Um, like maybe 15 minutes beforehand, the editor of that magazine named Nathaniel Webb, excuse me, actually sent me the proofs of my story that he'd finished going over and saying, "Look forward to this going live on Friday." He's like, "Thank you, I'll be able to
Well,
plug this."
yeah, fantastic.
Excellent timing.
Yeah, lot of time to plug it too.
I hope so. And I think it's an interesting piece because it's part of another secondary world that I'm slowly building. That's again fantasy, but it's also based on Central American folklore and mythology. I'm pulling on a lot of stuff from that region of the world because, as you can see from my complexion, that's kind of where I'm from. You might also be able to tell that by my last name. So I figured I'd start trying to create something that had a little bit of a flavor of that region. And this is the first piece that's managed to make it out into the world. So I hope people enjoy it.
Mhm. Well, that sounds fantastic, and I love the idea of a world that crosses over between stories.
Oh
You know,
yes,
it stretches
that's
from
that's
one story to another.
that's another wonderful thing about science fiction and fantasy is that there's this great history within the genre of creators just connecting their books and their stories through these little subtle hints and mentions and common world building. I mean, I think Clark, Asimov, Heinlein, the grandfathers of science fiction, they did it years and years ago. Tolkien obviously did it many years back. Robert E. Howard with his stories about Conan the Barbarian taking all taking place in the Hyborian Age. I think that's what he called it. So
Mhm.
it's just been, and of course, again to go back to Brandon Sanderson with his Cosmere books, it's just something that you're able to do quite easily in these genres, and we take full advantage of them.
No, I totally agree, and so a lot of the stuff that I've been working on lately is kind of linked one way or the other, and
Hmm.
I'm similar to that, try to drop in little hints and clues here and there to let you know that, yeah, this is connected to this, but just a little bit, you know? You don't wanna overdo it, but still.
Yeah, this one's for the nerds. That's the way I think of it. It's like all the because of course a lot of SF readers are they get more invested in a series than I think average readers do. Like they're very committed to it, and so they love finding those little things so they can go online and just say, hey, did anybody else see this? Oh my God,
Mhm.
it's amazing." It's like, yes, it is. You're welcome.
Definitely. I mean, world building is just an art in its own, and when you can create something that feels immersive, that your readers want to dive into and take part in, and it can just feel like an amazing thing.
Absolutely.
Um, so tell me, do you have some other works that you'd like to tell us about?
Well, the stuff I don't have very much stuff out there at the moment, just because I'm slowly invading the world one story at a time. But if they want to see if anybody who's watching this wants to read my oldest story, that would probably be in Beneath the Twin Suns, the first anthology that I was ever a part of. Story there called What Lopicor Did to Save His Love is there. Then there's my story in The New Normal, which is called The Count of Juan Diego Ruiz. I call it my zombie monkey story because it features a undead monkey.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it was really strange because I was writing that story just around the same time that I was writing the story that eventually appeared in the Red Room, which was Renee's crime fiction anthology, and Slow Recovery. So that there was a brief period of time where I was writing all three of them at once. So jumping between zombie monkey story, crime fiction story, and science fiction story, that was a very strange literary juggling act that I was pulling there. But I managed to do it because all three stories eventually made it to print. Um, and then there's my crime story, which is called "Deliver Us from Evil," which is about a youngish female former detective turned private eye who's trying to hunt down a serial killer who happened to be the murderer of her daughter, which is that was an interesting story because it's the farthest I've ever gotten in terms of writing sort of contemporary realism. Of course, it's not
Mhm.
realism really, but it's as far as I've ever gotten from writing science fiction and fantasy and managing to write it. I think a fairly successful story in the long run,
Mhm.
and it's the only piece I've ever written where I wrote all the scenes out of order, which was really weird for me because I'm usually one of those people who tends to write in sequence. You know, this, then this, then this, then this, because I need to understand the causality, but not in that case because it was it was it was really strange, but it was a lot of fun to write. And then, of course, the one my story in Starcrossed is still there, plus all the stuff I have uh, kind of hovering out there in the future. So that's pretty much it. That pretty much covers it.
Well, I think you got more on your list than you expected to.
Oh, and I forgot one. Uh, my Bree Gary, again, the editor who was putting together the monthology, she published a story of mine on her website called The Angry Noodle, which is just a wonderful name for a website, called Oscar Ambrose's Magicpedia Guide to Modern Mirror Making, which is possibly the most ridiculous story I've ever written, as you can probably guess by the title. And it's just a little piece of sort of contemporary fantasy flash fiction that if anybody watching this wants to get a sense of what I can do when I'm at my most silly, that would be it.
Well, sounds fantastic, and I got to think writing all these stories with different genres and different concepts at one time had to have some lead to some funny dreams.
That's one way of putting it. Yeah, it's it definitely was a little bit strange for me, just because, like, as I said earlier, I tend to focus on science fiction and fantasy. Those are the two things I love, and those are the two genres that I mostly stick to. But every once in a while, it's also fun to kind of stretch yourself and to try
Mhm.
something new. And that's what's been so great about these, about doing these anthologies the last couple of years, is just having that opportunity to try new things and seeing if there's anything else I might enjoy doing. I, I I wasn't entirely sure if my zombie monkey story was going to work, just because I thought, I don't know if people are going to find this scary or not, because of course when you think zombies you think horror, but I'm going to do it just because let's see what happens. um, and writing just straight fairly contemporary crime fiction was interesting for two reasons. One, because I didn't have to do as much world building, which is just sort of something I do automatically, considering what I typically write, but also being able to use a different kind of language, a more contemporary language, more
Mhm.
everyday, more like what you'd hear people today speaking, as opposed to something that was not necessarily otherworldly, but something that sounds a little bit more alien, maybe a little bit more universal, maybe not so rooted in a particular time like now. So yeah, it had its challenges, but it was also enjoyable. And yes, it did lead to some strange dreams that I'm still having.
Well, and I think you make a fantastic point that when you write in multiple genres, or you try something new, especially even if it is within the same genre of something you are typically writing in, that stretching your legs and kind of, stretching your mind and saying, figuring out a new way to write something, I think is a fantastic exercise. Um, when we first started talking about the Star-Crossed, I hadn't written very much romance. That was probably the first romance type story I've put together. Now I've had some romance in some of my books here or there, but typically it's not the full arc that you would expect from a romance type story.
Hmm.
So it was an interesting thing to play with, and I'll have to admit I've probably employed more of those types of relationships in my stories since writing that, and it was a neat thing to learn.
Yeah, I found that too. More recently, I've been between doing passes of revisions on my novel. I've been writing more short stories, not necessarily for any submission calls, but just ones that ones for myself that maybe eventually I'll be able to sell to a periodical or two. And one of the more recent ones I wrote had kind of a romance subplot in it. So, doing all that work under Renee's tutelage has kind of it's gotten into my stuff a lot more, and I didn't expect that to happen. But it's nice because it, on the one hand, it adds a greater depth of humanity to some of your characters because you can
Hmm.
see their vulnerable side a little bit more. Because of course, when you are, what's that famous quote? Love makes fools of us all.
Hmm.
uh, you can see their vulnerable side in that. So you've got extra dimensions to your characters, but it also adds for interesting conflict as well.
Hmm.
Because of course, when two characters are possibly pining for each other, or your point of view character is pining for somebody, and they're not able to communicate that comfortably. It
Hmm.
makes for some, it can make for some interesting comedy at the very least, and certainly a lot
Hmm.
more conflict between people, in addition to whatever other conflict you happen to have in the story.
Yeah, it definitely adds layers to motivation
Absolutely.
within your piece. Definitely. Well, I want to say thank you, Ian, for joining us today. And I'll remind everyone that all of Ian's information is in the description below the video here, including his Twitter and his website. I believe we also have some of your podcasts linked there as well.
Yes.
So I would encourage everyone to go and check those out. And if our audience wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way for either readers or other authors to come say hi to you?
Well, the two best places would be either my blog, which I'm still maintaining pretty religiously. That's Ian's Two Cents at blogspot.com,
Mhm.
.blogspot.com, excuse me. Um, Pretty much every single project I've been a part of so far, I've done a post about that just around the time or just before it was due to come out. So I'm updating people about my ongoing stuff there. And then, of course, there's my Twitter, which is my main social media, and
Mhm.
that's still the best place to get in touch with me directly if you don't know however else to get in touch with me. And then you just so happen to mention my podcast, which which is not a regular thing that I do. I do it mostly in the summer. Um,
Mhm.
it's called 4 Cents a Podcast because
Mhm.
doing a podcast takes a lot more effort than doing a blog post, so it's a little bit more costly. Hence the name. But that's I do that, and there I've done promotional episodes talking about each of the anthologies as they've been coming out. Um, I don't know necessarily how well they've helped sales, but I hope they've helped sales. And I talk about a lot of other things, what's going on in the world. I occasionally do readings of stories. I've done readings of my own stuff more recently on the podcast, including a reading of Oscar Ambrose, in case anybody ever wants to hear how ridiculous that story is. Um, so that, yes, and that you can find on pretty much any podcasting platform, Spotify,
Mhm.
Google Podcasts, anywhere.
And once again, we have links to all those in the description down below. So go ahead and check those guys out. Once again, Ian, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
All right. And thank you guys for watching.